Well, hey, what's up, everybody? What's up, YouTube? Pastor Matt here. Had the serendipity of discovering this multi-volume set when I recently visited the RTS bookstore library. Some used books I came across: Geerhardus Vos, Reformed Dogmatics, newly translated into English by Richard Gaffin Jr. I found volumes 1 and 2, which I have subsequently read cover to cover, and I wanted to talk about them very briefly with you this morning by way of recommendation. Now, if you happen to be Presbyterian or Reformed, of course, we already have an embarrassment of riches in the Reformed tradition when it comes to our systematic theologies. We have, of course, the big one, the great one, John Calvin, Institutes of the Christian Religion, 1559. Right now, actually, this is pretty cool. Petrus Van Maastricht's Theoretical Practical Theology is coming into the English language. I've done a review on Volume 1, which I read cover to cover, and I just received Volume 2 in the mail, so I plan to talk about that at some point in the near future. We have, of course, Charles Hodge's 3-volume set, the green volumes, an excellent systematic theology from the Princetonian era. And then one of my favorites, if I'm completely honest, would be Berkhof's single-volume systematic theology. I found that this guy right here has pretty much everything I need in a very readable and compact form. 1 volume, got everything you need. And then if you're looking for something maybe a little bit more updated, of course, there's John Frame's Systematic Theology, and this also comes in a slightly different form in the 3-volume set, the Doctrine of the Word of God, the Doctrine of God, etc. But today, we're talking about Geerhardus Vos and his multi-volume set, Reformed Dogmatics by Lexham Press. All right, so why do we need another multi-volume set of Reformed doctrine? Well, we don't, but we're blessed to have it, and we thank God for the riches of our tradition. You probably already know Geerhardus Vos from his biblical theology, and that's where he really made his mark at Calvin Theological Seminary and then later at Princeton. We think of him primarily for his biblical theology. If you listen to the Reformed Forum, which is a wonderful podcast that I highly commend, they are big Voss fans. In fact, they recently came out with a new biography of Geerhardus Vos, and they have a whole series of podcasts called Voss Group, where you can listen to primarily his biblical theology stuff. But let's go ahead and talk about these multi-volumes. Again, I've read 1 and 2 cover to cover, but I don't have 3, 4, and 5, so I can't really speak intelligently on those, but I'll tell you what I have learned. First of all, a little bit about Geerhardus Vos himself, 1862 to 1949. He's a Dutch-American theologian. I'm just reading from the back flyleaf here. Don't think I'm a genius. I don't have this memorized. But he's considered by many to be the father of modern Reformed biblical theology. He studied at the University of Berlin, the University of Strasbourg, and finally Calvin College, then the Theological School of the Christian Reformed Church, which is a Christian Reformed denomination today, where he delivered the lectures that would become Reformed Dogmatics. So one of the things you need to know about this multi-volume series is this is really a series of class notes, and you're going to find that immediately when you begin reading through it, that it doesn't read like a full book necessarily. It's more of an outline, and yes, it is in full sentence form, but you're going to be able to see the outline form here when we crack the spine and open it up here in just a moment. Returning to his biography, Voss held Princeton's new chair of biblical theology from 1893 until his retirement in 1932, and his thinking and scholarship deeply influenced the biblical and theological work of Cornelius Van Til, John Murray, Herman Ridderbos, and Richard B. Gaffin. So here's the guy who inspired some of these guys that would later become fairly well known in Reformed circles. Cornelius Van Til would probably be one of the greatest of those 4. Okay, so these are the class notes, really. Now, what's interesting about this set is it just recently came into English, originally written in Geerhardus Vos's Dutch language. And it's pretty cool that both Van Maastricht, which I mentioned before, and Geerhardus Vos are coming into English now for the first time. So this is some pretty cool stuff for us who are interested in the guys that inspired some of our heroes. What I mean by that is Geerhardus Vos inspired the 4 men that I just mentioned, and Petrus Van Maastricht was, of course, Jonathan Edwards' favorite systematic theology, and actually his favorite books in the whole world. That's what he said in one of his letters. So when we open this up, we're going to notice that this looks a little bit different than many systematic theologies. It is actually in an outline form. You have points, you have subpoints. You can see here point 4, A, B. Sometimes the outline gets a little bit sparse. You can see there on the bottom right-hand page. Some of the points are just 1 or 2 sentences each. And that's both a strength and a weakness to this set, if I'm completely honest. The strength being you can clearly see the flow of his logic as he works from topic to topic. But sometimes he says very little about certain things, and he goes on and on and on other topics. Here's another example of the kind of a more skeletal outline form. Some of his answers are just a sentence or 2. Now, you'll notice too the question and answer format. It's almost catechetical in that he goes kind of like the shorter catechism or the larger catechism of Westminster. He asks a question, then answers it. He asks his own question, and then he answers it in his own words. And I find that to be very helpful. It's very readable, and the way that Lexham Press really laid this out is just very attractive to the eye. You know, sometimes you get an old book and the font is so small and the text is so dense that you can hardly just force yourself intellectually, mentally to keep going. But because of the outline form of that, it just kind of reads through very quickly. Excuse me. Sorry about that. So he covers in these first couple volumes, which I read, Volume 1, Theology Proper, where he talks about the Trinity, he talks about God's sovereignty, and he begins with predestination, which he covers fairly early in his systematic theology. Now, Calvin saved predestination for later, but Voss gets to it right away. Volume 2 is about anthropology, has to do with mankind, our nature, the image of God within us, and especially in pertinence to sin. And then he gets on to the covenant of grace later on in the work. Now, a couple of strengths and weaknesses as far as I read the book and assessed it myself. Strengths, I love the brief answers. I love the question and answer form. I love the fact that it felt like I was reading teaching notes from the classroom, which kind of had a lively spirit to it as he went through his content. I loved the short sentences. He does not have a lot of long sentences because primarily these were his notes that he prepared for lecture. So you're not going to have long, winding, very difficult sentences to follow. And again, I thought the format in which this was laid out was very good. As far as weaknesses go in this series, you know, the one thing that kind of bothered me a little bit is that he's not very confessional. I'm not saying he diverges from the confessions. He was not a Westminster guy. As a Presbyterian, he's from the Reformed Church tradition, so he'd be a 3 forms of unity, Belgic Confession, Heidelberg Catechism, Canons of Dort. But he really doesn't refer to them very often, which I kind of thought was a little bit disappointing. In fact, he doesn't refer to a lot of other theologians positively. He only usually refers to others when he's critiquing their views. And that is actually another, maybe a mild weakness that I found when I was reading through this myself, is that very often he'll introduce a concept and then he will deconstruct the views that he doesn't like. But I didn't think he was always as clear when he was constructing his own views or what he's arguing for. And again, I think he would have really helped his cause if he had referred more consistently to the Reformed confessions, drawing the reader back to those great confessional statements that might have stated some things more positively. So it does seem like he's presenting the negative viewpoints and disassembling them, but sometimes it's hard to tell what he's actually arguing for. And that was just my gut view when I was reading through this. Let's see, what else can I say? There were times where he was rigorously exegetical, and I really appreciated that. And you could tell where his pet doctrines were and what he was interested in by the length of his comments on any particular subject. There were some things that he really wanted to do a deep dive into. For instance, when he gets into predestination, he does some very excellent exegetical work in the book of Romans, chapter 9. I mean, he almost does a full exegesis of that whole passage. But there are other topics that I thought he skimmed over almost too quickly, as though he assumed the reader's knowledge or perhaps was less interested in it himself. And so he kind of breezes through the Trinity a little bit, obviously wanting to talk more about predestination. But we all have our preferences and our predilections, don't we? We all have certain things that we're more interested in. And because these were prepared as class notes, and I don't know that they were ever actually prepared to become a multi-volume systematic theology, you do get the sense of where he wanted to take his classroom discussion with his students. And from that perspective, I find this work very, very helpful. I have a friend who's also worked through these volumes, and he said he loved taking these to the coffee shop before church and just reading through them almost devotionally, because the sections are quite short, the paragraphs are short, and because of the outline form, it really does work well with short reading sessions where you can just kind of pick it up, leaf through it a bit, jump forward to some things that you're more interested in. But overall, I do think this is going to be a lasting contribution to Reformed theology. Michael Horton says here on the cover that this is like a lost Shakespeare play recently discovered, and that's probably true. Wouldn't it be cool to find the notes of some of the greatest professors and teachers in our tradition and have those in your hands? Well, that's actually what we have with Geerhardus Vos's Reformed Dogmatics. Okay, so as always, I'll post a series of links in the comments or the description of this video, where you can go and buy the multi-volume set or some of the others that I've mentioned already in this video. Okay, thanks for checking in. Love you lots. Talk to you later.